Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination podcast. I'm delighted today to have as my guest Dion Kathawa. He is a law clerk at the Michigan Supreme Court. He has a law degree from the University of Notre Dame, an undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan. He's actually quite a prolific writer, has a lot of essays, and I'll put links to those up on the Moral Imagination website. And first of all, before we go, I just want to thank everyone for your support. Thanks to all those who've written review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts. If you like the podcast, please do give it a 5-star rating. It helps grow the podcast. And thanks to all those who've supported me on Patreon. And again, you can get my book, my little book, Digital Contagion. I told you already that I have an infographic that's free if you, I'll collect your data and then I'll give you a free infographic if you go to themoralimagination.com, and you can get the book at Amazon, either in Kindle or in paperback. So speaking of technology, I'm very happy to have Dion Kathawa on the podcast today. And we're going to talk about a couple of his essays at the Public Discourse and one of the Josiahs on technology, transhumanism, and really how to address think about a lot of the technological challenges that are coming our way. So Dion, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. So let's begin. You have a couple of essays, and you've been thinking about this question. You're a lawyer. You have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. So these are things you're thinking about. Maybe before we get to kind of the details of your argument, why don't you give me what piqued your interest in transhumanism? Why did you see it as a danger? And in one sense, it's kind of an old thing. It's a Gnostic element. You also argue that it's also a new thing. And maybe why don't you give me a summary of kind of what your biggest concerns are and what got you to start to write and think about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, what piqued my interest is just how ubiquitous technology is in our everyday lives. I mean, I think our age is, like you say, it's a technological age. It's marked by just technology everywhere. It permeates every aspect of our lives, and it's not something that we can sort of easily extricate ourselves from, or really separate ourselves from in any meaningful way. At least at the moment, I think there's not sufficient societal desire to separate ourselves from our technology and return to something, sort of prior to what you would call the digital revolution or the technological revolution that we're currently living through. And just like in my own life, social media was a big part of at least my high school, college years. I didn't really use social media, prior to that point, but it does just have such a sort of magnetic hold on people, and it's sort of impossible to escape. But, one year I gave up all social media for Lent when I was in law school, and I immediately noticed I was much happier. And that probably was the start of my own, as with all things, grace prompted, and then I responded, and then I started to think about it. And that's kind of how I ended up where I am now.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's true. I think sometimes you take a break and you think you can't do without it. And then all of a sudden you realize, not only can I not do without it, I'm much happier. Yeah. So it's an interesting problem. So you begin your first essay at the Public Discourse. And again, to listeners, I'll put links up to all these, and also to Dion's Substack as well. So you can follow him in a lot of different places. You say humanity and technology are on a collision course. Especially you're talking about digital technology, right? Not cars and pens and pencils, but digital technology. And that technological exponential advancement, you say, poses an existential threat to humanity and to human dignity. And you say, we discuss human dignity. We tend to focus on the dignity half, but we really have to pay attention to the human half. And that, in fact, digital technology is not just threatening our dignity, it's actually threatening our humanity. Can you talk about that? And maybe first how it's threatening our humanity, and then some of your worries about dignity.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's worth noting that the essay was sort of an adaptation of a talk I gave at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture Conference at Notre Dame this past November 2021. And the conference was sort of centered on human dignity. And, as expected, a lot of people talked about, what does dignity mean? What are its contours? What are the historical roots of dignity? What does it mean philosophically? All these other things. Those were all, it was all really interesting stuff. But I think that I decided to take an approach that was probably going to be, the road less taken, if you will, the road less traveled by, talking about the human aspect. Because I think we could talk about dignity all we want. And, there is a dignity to different things, right? I mean, animals have a kind of dignity. The created world has a kind of dignity. But human dignity is something particular. It's something unique. And if humanity is sufficiently erased, effaced, changed, then what human dignity means stops meaning what we've always thought it meant. And I think digital technology, really just that kind of the scientific materialist mindset, threatens the existence of human beings, not just in sort of a fiery holocaust of nuclear weapons, but sort of at the deepest level of our biology and what it sort of means to interact with the world in a human way. Like social media sort of, undercuts our rational capacities in a lot of ways. And so I think that was kind of the focus of what I wanted to get into was what do we do when technology threatens who and what we are?
So let's talk about that. I mean, you say scientific materialism is a threat. And I think this is an important distinction, right? Obviously, scientific materialism can be a threat, as we've seen in the 20th century. But you're saying not just in like the threat that human beings don't matter, they're just matter to be kind of molded by social engineers. But actually, in a different way, scientific materialism is actually threatening our very humanity, I guess is maybe the adjective, that like what we are as ensouled organisms, as biological, like Homo sapiens, right? That technology is actually, and scientific materialism and technology combined, like the social engineer is no longer simply engineering men and women in society. They're actually engineering men and women to change us. Is that your argument?
And that's it's just what I call the technological gaze, this notion that it's the technology itself, but it's really the intention behind it, like you're talking about. It's sort of the aim of, they would call it improving humanity. It would be sort of, we're going to create super people and all these other things, which, I think sounds great in theory, but I think in a similar way that I think people on the right should eventually outgrow Ayn Rand, I think the same kind of, sort of crazy optimism about what we can do to human beings should also be something that we outgrow and sort of repair to deeper traditions about the goodness of being human as we are.
I'm probably combining the two articles here, so forgive me, but you do make this distinction, I think it's in your second article, between how to think about technology as restoring, like medicine and technology restoring us, versus a type of enhancement that is actually changing us. Can you develop that a little bit?
Yeah, so I got this from a nice essay from Father Waldstein. I think it was at the Plow where he wrote it. Talks, I think it's called the Lords of Nature or something. And he makes the point that, sort of therapeutics are legitimate uses of technology, right? I would classify it as part of, God's command, to have dominion over the earth, and subdue it, right? And I think technology has always been with us, right? I mean, like the wheel is technology, right? I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Right. So there's sort of no getting around the fact that human beings, as stewards of creation, we actually are given the great gift of sort of building a world. I get this idea from Mark Barnes over at New Polity, talking about in their podcast on tyranny, their multi-part series on tyranny. Human beings are world builders. And so we imitate God when we create things. So that's part of what we are, who and what we are. And to restore natural function is just to repair what God has given us, right? It's to heal what's been given. But when we start moving beyond that and attempting to make ourselves into something we're not, when we strike at our humanity in a fundamental way at the genetic level, I think that poses a serious problem. I think it poses a problem of really of existential import.
So let's talk about that a little bit. I think you make some important points. So let's first say, like, do you think any genetic manipulation is morally problematic or humanly problematic?
I think it would, to sort of just to be general about it, I think it would be a case by case question. I think it's something that we're still grappling with as it comes up. I mean, this is really the first time in history we've had the ability to do something like this. So I think there's a lot of prudence that needs to be brought to bear on the question, a lot of wisdom that needs to be brought to bear on the question. So I wouldn't want to say categorically that any genetic engineering is wrong, but I think if the aim of the genetic engineering was to restore something that was damaged, or to bring whatever damage happens into sort of the way that it's supposed to be. You can imagine some kind of genetic defect in the womb. If it could be restored to the way that it ought to be, then I would say there's a presumptive kind of validity to that. But you get into complicated questions about Down syndrome. You wouldn't want to say, because a lot of people that know, I don't know anyone with Down syndrome. No one in my family has it or anything like that. But people do speak, with great love about people they know with Down syndrome. And they often say things like, this person with Down syndrome is the most holy person I know, or the nicest person that I know, the kindest person that I know. So I think there's real challenges to what we mean by the way things ought to be. But I think to try to create something, sort of superhuman in its form, I think is that's a clear line we can draw.
Mm-hmm. So like something like sickle cell anemia, right? Where you're making that would be a restorative.
Yeah.
Right. So a scientist I know, he makes this distinction. I'll try to get it right. He uses this restore enhance distinction as well. And says, that like there's one thing about, there's also complexity. Like we don't actually know everything that's going on. And so you don't, and this is kind of his point, like you don't have to know everything to restore. Right? You don't have to know exactly how the finger works in every single way to sew the finger back on. You don't have to know everything about how, for example, when we look, what's happening with our eyes and what's happening with like the neurons and like the connection and all the things that are happening, all the things that we're taking in and our cognitive and non-cognitive awareness and the different hemispheres of the brain. You don't have to know that to reattach the retina after a detached retina. But when you start, in a sense, enhancing, now, like what are often called off-target effects, right? There's a hubris that now enters because there's a rejection of complexity. And I think this maybe goes to you quote C.S. Lewis' Abolition of Man, and listeners know that I love that book. In fact, I have a podcast about that book with Father Michael Ward. And, he says man's power over nature is always some men's power over other men. And there's a certain kind of hubris that goes into the enhance versus the restore. What do you think that's a correct articulation, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And like you're saying about the retina, I mean, to reattach it after it's been detached just requires you to know sort of the basics about how to reattach a retina, right? It's just sort of this localized reattachment. But to sort of enhance the retina to say, see ultraviolet light or something like that, like to sort of genetically engineer the retina so that we could see more of the color spectrum outside of what we can normally see, would require you to know a heck of a lot more about how the retina interacts with everything else in the body, how the retina interfaces with the entire world, what would be the effects of being able to see ultraviolet light or something like that. It just requires a massive amount more information that, frankly, if the last couple of years have taught us anything, it's that all the people with the fancy letters after their name don't really know as much as they claim to know. So I would question them presumptively.
Yeah, Nassim Taleb calls this naive interventionism, which I like. I think it's right. And like you see, for example, look at the 20th century and the 21st century of all the social engineering projects that have gone wrong because it was naive interventionism. I mean, I think a classic example is just population control. I mean, we spent billions of dollars trying to limit populations. And probably listeners know, I don't even think there's good evidence that it causes poverty. What we did also do is we created an unprecedented boy-girl deficit, right? Mm-hmm. And now there's going to be all these effects, including, I would argue, the commodification of women that is part of naive interventionism. Now, with certain parts of genetic engineering, we're taking this down into like the molecular and the genetic level, and we have no idea of the possible off-target effects. So I think it's deeply problematic, and I think in a sense of hubris that Lewis really articulates in The Abolition of Man.
Yeah, and the more fundamental the level of tinkering occurs at, the more likely the ripple is going to be larger, right? I mean, so if you tinker with the tax code, it's going to have some kind of ripple effect, but it's not going to be as fundamental as tinkering with creating a new species or making human beings into something that they're not. Just like you're talking about population, that's more fundamental than the tax code, which is, less fundamental than tinkering with human beings themselves.
Yeah, I think so. Another thing I was going to ask you this later, but maybe we'll go to it now. So one of the things, Dion, that creates a problem for me, and you're a lawyer and an ethicist, so you think about this. One of the things you'll hear when you talk about gene editing, and we kind of jumped into gene editing faster. That's in your second article. But one of the things people talk about is almost like it's like an inversion, and I think there's inversions going on in the way we think about human beings. There's like an inverted Thomism almost, where we've taken essence and existence and flipped them. And I think there's an inversion here of morality where there's almost the sense, and you hear it in a lot of different places, like Walter Isaacson uses this language in his book about Jennifer Doudna. You hear it in a lot of different places. Will we have a moral responsibility to enhance our children, to give them the best opportunity? They're taking a very different tact than you. You're saying, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, we have a moral responsibility to, in a sense, respect the nature of the kind of thing that we are, and be very, very careful in any kind of tinkering at fundamental levels, because we just don't know what the negative effects are. And I think I'm going to put words in your mouth, but this was one fundamental problem with germline editing, is that we don't know what's the effects in the long term are. And even at this point, like Jennifer Doudna and others, right, she's the inventor of CRISPR, for listeners if they don't know that, one of the inventors with Emmanuelle Charpentier, I think is her name. And she's actually right now on a moratorium on germline editing, right? I mean, how long that's going to last, I'm not very confident, but because I think there's a race into like kind of a technological race, but there's a sense like, okay, that's going too far. And you're saying you shouldn't do this. But the other argument is, well, won't we have a moral responsibility to give our children the best possible things we can give them? Don't we have a moral responsibility to make them healthier, stronger, taller? I mean, like, I don't have very good hair. Shouldn't I have better hair? And increase our IQ points. And this is the kind of sense. Now, some of it's, I think, science fiction, but that's in a sense the driving moral. It's in a sense a moral argument of why we should manipulate human beings. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it kind of creates a prisoner's dilemma, right? If some people are going to enhance, then it almost requires everyone else to. Otherwise, you're gonna. I mean, you can spin out the sci-fi movie scenarios all you want. It's I forget which movie it was. Yeah, it's probably not worth even getting into. But there's one movie that I saw a few years ago where, like, sort of the enhanced elites live like on the moon, and everyone else lives on the sort of ravaged Earth, and then they sort of come down to pillage it for resources, and then they go back up to live in their Eden on the moon, basically. And you can clearly see that that's where that kind of thing will go. If there's this resolute, sort of stubbornly resistant group of people that says, no, I actually like being human and I'm not going to do that. Or, if they even think that, maybe they just can't afford it, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can get that kind of bifurcation. But I think, more fundamentally, not just for the bad outcomes that it would have on our social life and things like that, but more fundamentally, it rests on a misunderstanding of the purpose of being human. I mean, I think the whole point of being human is not to be smarter, faster, stronger, more beautiful. That really is a serious misunderstanding of the point of why we're here. And, before the show, we were talking a little bit about the liturgy, and in the Eastern Rite, just after the bread and wine are consecrated, the priest and the people together. I think it's the only place in the Mass in the Eastern Rite liturgy where the priest and the people speak together, and they say together, "Sanctify our bodies by your holy body, pardon our sins by your precious blood, and purify our conscience by your mercy. Christ, you are the hope of our nature forever." I mean, the whole point of being here is to imitate Christ, right? I mean, Christ, didn't seek after enhancement of his own body and enhancement of his own intellect and becoming the fastest and the strongest, right? He gave himself up for all of us, right? He looked on our humanity, assumed it, and redeemed it, right? He elevated it into the Trinity. It's about virtue. It's about charity to our neighbor. It's about being just to one another. All of those things might, if we're lucky, be enhanced by us being more intelligent, but I have to say, I'm skeptical that more intelligence is going to help us with that project.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's been very intelligent people who've done a lot of wicked things. And again, back C.S. Lewis, he says a lot of the crime today is, it's not in dark alleys. It's in boardrooms with people with perfectly trimmed fingernails, who are like constructing these terrible, really hell on earth. So I think that's an interesting point. But at the core of this, of course, but you're getting right to this, ultimately a different vision of what it means to be a human being. And so earlier you talked about scientific materialism, but you have a materialist view and, in a sense, a theological view. So in your essay, and I know this gets a bit complex, but you talk, and I guess this is the talk at Notre Dame, that the intellectual history of this development of technology. Could you go into a little bit, like where do you, and again, correct me if if you think I'm not phrasing the question correctly, but like, it's interesting because say someone who's a secular person, right, who doesn't believe, would say, well, like, why are you bringing religion into this? Like, what are you talking about? Like, now you're talking about the liturgy, you're talking about redemption, you're talking about Christ offering himself. And correct me, but I think what you might answer is, that's the fundamental question. Like, which religion are we going to take? Are we going to take a religion of, say, the Jewish and Christian tradition that affirms the goodness of being and a certain kind of being, the human nature that we have that's created good and then fallen, but called to redemption? Or are we going to have a different theological vision, and that secularism isn't some kind of neutral scientific position? It's actually has underlying philosophical assumptions. And it seems like that's maybe at the core. I mean, we can talk about CRISPR technology more, and like I think you lay out a couple of different challenges of where we're going, and I'd like to get into that. But maybe the big difference is how we think about technology ultimately comes to how we think about the human person and how we think about like the goodness or lack thereof of being and matter. Because you argue human beings are good, but other people would say they're not good. So like, how would you kind of articulate that? Maybe going into the work on intellectual history, but thinking of a questioner like that, saying, okay, well, I mean, why are you bringing religion into it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would just respond, how can I not bring religion into it? I mean, we're talking about, kind of like you say, I mean, this is fundamentally a religious problem. I mean, what we're talking about is who and what we're going to worship, right? How are we going to live in the world that we find ourselves in, right? And I think the response is actually, there's a really good article by Stanley Fish from 96 in First Things, where he talks about discourse and liberalism and sort of viewpoint neutrality. And he uses Milton's Paradise Lost as an example. And I don't have it memorized by heart or anything, but and it's much more beautiful as Milton puts it. But Adam and Lucifer are both created by God. Adam's response, all right, maybe I should start with Lucifer. Lucifer's response is he suddenly finds himself in the world and he says, because I don't know where I came from, I must have created myself, right? Adam comes into the world and says, and he's examining his arms and just everything about his body. And he says, what, sort of beautiful maker there must have been to create me, right? Importantly, neither of them know where they came from, right? But the sort of lens they bring to bear on the issue colors how they see themselves and then how they act, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the fundamental question, is what sort of pre-theoretical lens do we bring to bear on a subject, right? Do we believe that these sort of, like Lewis calls, sort of the fundamental axioms of practical reason, right? Do they start us on our journey, or are they things that we feel like we're entitled to challenge? And one of those axioms I submit is that it's good to be human. I mean, what else could it be? I mean, we exist, right? Is it what's the alternative? If being a human is a curse, you're in a bad position. I mean, how are you going to, if being human is a curse, then presumably a lot of the things because you're human are bad, and your own perceptions are not to be trusted, and just your very existence is somehow corrupt. I mean, you're in a bad place if that's the case. I think everything that we start out with is a question of faith. Are we going to have faith in our goodness, in the fact that we were created with love? Or are we going to see everything as a curse and something to be overcome by our own efforts? And I think that's the fundamental question that's in front of us.
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind. One is like, why is reason better than non-reason? Right? Why is justice better than injustice? I mean, I think that's a question that it goes to the heart of this. Like, even the scientific enterprise relies upon pre-axiomatic ideas that certain things are worth doing. A second point that comes is Joseph Ratzinger in his homilies from 1981, 1983. This the future Pope Benedict has some homilies on creation, and he makes this distinction and makes this argument or distinction between how the Hebrew Bible actually stands out quite remarkably from the rest of the ideas at the time, where the world is made of dragon's blood or dragon's skin, or somehow was a curse of the gods or a demiurge created this evil world. That's a dominant thing. So, I mean, to push you a little bit, I agree with you. Okay. And listeners know oh, well, Michael obviously agrees with that. And I'm working on a little other project called Reframe, these foundational ideas. And one of them is being is good. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's how you see being is bad. So, but in a sense, I mean, there's a lot of traditions that would say, no, it's not. It's a curse. Right. And, Jordan Peterson, who in our household we call JP3, so JP3 as this, I think it's his chapter in 12 Rules for Life on the Columbine shooters, right? Basically said the world's evil. And so it comes to this point, I'm going from, JP3 to Thomas, where if evil was a thing in itself, it would destroy itself, right? So this is and I know we've actually just communicated about this before, but we can maybe talk about it in another podcast. But this question of what is evil a force in itself? Is it a privation? I mean, these are really foundational questions that you get to, but I think it's interesting. So I want to keep going in this direction, but it's not a simple solution, right, Dion, to this problem. I mean, you're making a case from the Hebrew Bible and the Christian tradition that being is good. And there's a lot of traditions that say it's a curse. How do you respond to that person? Because I think there's two things going on. There's the Adam and Satan example you gave from Stanley Fish. And then there's nihilism knocking at our door. That actually creation is not good and something to be escaped from. One, do you think that's correct? And I'm not asking you to respond to all the things in Ratzinger and everything, just this two frameworks. One is Adam versus Satan in the Stanley Fish. Okay. And in fact, I'll quote it here. I found it. You said, this is Fish. Satan's way of thinking is contrasted directly in the poem with Adam's. Recalling the moment, not of his creation, but after his creation, Adam reports, myself I peruse limb by limb. I could speak a name, but who was I? Where? Or what cause? Knew not. And so like Satan, Adam doesn't know where he is. Mm-hmm. And he says, the goodness and power for which Satan seeks independent evidence is assumed by Adam. And one assumption in its place generates a program for action and a life project. How may I know him? How adore from whom I have, that thus I move and live. And that's the one side. And then there's the Satan side. It's I made myself. Power is what matters. That's the first. The second is maybe not so strong as Satan. It's just the world's horrible. It's a horrible place filled with suffering and misery and evil. And Dion's crazy to think it's good. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful objection. There is a lot of suffering in the world, and the problem of suffering is a real thing. I think in a lot of ways, the problem of suffering is really a species of the problem of the hiddenness of God. I mean, if God is real, why doesn't he step in and stop the suffering, right? And I think what I would say is, I suppose I would, in the same way that the Adam Lucifer framework kind of hinges on a sort of pre-theoretical assertion about what is, I might just assert in the face of my detractors that if they look harder, they'll find what I see, and they'll see that it's more foundational than the kind of evil that they see. I think that in the same way that Adam looks at himself and wants to know who made him, and that's his life project, whereas Lucifer opposes it. I mean, we all have this experience in a less dramatic way. I mean, we're born into a family And suddenly at around, I don't know when it is, but, at some point we become sort of self-aware of ourselves, right? We're sort of, I don't know, maybe 7 years old or something like that. We're aware that we exist. We're not these other people. We have a kind of narrative of ourselves as we live out our lives. And that was a gift of our parents, right? I mean, regardless of how our parents treat us, it's nonetheless the case that we did not make ourselves, and there are some good things in our lives, even though it might not be as good as we might wish it to be. Those good things are what are more foundational. I mean, people can rail against it all they want, but the only people who consistently live out the nihilist view that you're talking about are people like the Columbine shooters. So at some level,
and we don't want
those willing to bite that bullet.
Yeah, that's dark. It's dark and despairing and harmful. We don't, and we don't want people to live out the nihilistic vision.
Of course.
So, I think a lot of it comes down to, in a sense, I think you're right, the problem of evil, and then the question of whether evil is a privation or not.
Yeah.
And that would be, say, that St. Thomas's articulate. Well, I mean, this is like the Jewish and Christian tradition's response that evil is a privation.
Right.
Maybe you want to explain that a bit, because I think that's at the core of what you're thinking, right? I mean, it seems to me, it was funny because you had said to me, hey, well, maybe we'll talk about evil. I was like, oh, well, let's do that on the podcast. And here we are talking about evil, but I think it actually is related, right? To
yes.
The challenge, because we'll talk in a minute about some of the challenges that are coming from technology. And you talk about liquidation, you talk about enhancement, you talk about like transhumanism, et cetera. So, but maybe let's just spend us at least a little bit on this very complex problem. Did I say this on the podcast? I don't remember if I said it on the podcast or not, but I will tell you a story before we get into this, because I think it prepares you and me and listeners from any hubris. I might have told Carter Sneed. I don't remember. But anyway, so I wrote a paper in graduate school on philosophy, and I wrote something in the and this is how, St. Thomas, this is why St. Thomas thinks evil is a privation. Mm-hmm. And I kept going. And my advisor wrote the following. Oh, it was with, I think it was with James Madden. That's who I talked about it with. The podcast with James Madden. And he said, so I'm like, yeah, this is why Thomas thinks evil is a privation. And he wrote, ooh, Miller the Magnificent solves excruciatingly difficult, complex problems with a few glib one-liners. The best comment, the best comment ever, right? I mean, I laughed out loud and I deserved it, so I deleted it. But anyway, to say that right now we're going to be kind of, Dion and Michael the Magnificents here are going to try to solve complex philosophical problems. But I do think it's worth at least saying this, because there might be listeners who think like, wait a minute, evil is a privation. Like, what are you talking about? So let's talk about that, because I think that's, if I'm hearing you, that's partially when you're saying, if you look closer, you're going to see that good must be the foundation and evil must be a privation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember years ago reading Kraft and Tuschinski, I think, a Jesuit. They wrote a book on Catholic apologetics that basically touches on every major topic. I was reading it in college, and I got to the section on evil. I think they traced it. I think they might have started the discussion with Augustine and maybe gotten into Thomas a little bit later. But I think Augustine was maybe the first, because he was part of the Manichaean heresy and all these other things. So I think he was maybe the first to kind of, at least in the Christian tradition, to sort of crack the conundrum of good and evil. And the way they phrased it, it might have been directly from Augustine, but evil is parasitic on the good, right? It requires some prior thing to pervert, to sort of quote unquote exist, right? I think a lot of what drives my thought in this area is just our experience. I think common experience of all people. I think when we're mistreated, something in us swells up in rebellion against that, right? And we say, this is not how it ought to be. Nobody gets mistreated unless they've been sort of thoroughly brainwashed from birth or something like this to think that their mistreatment is warranted. But no one generally healthy who has some sense of how the world ought to be gets mistreated by a friend, by a parent, by a sibling, by a coworker, and says, yes, this is exactly the way the world should look when it's functioning correctly, right? When order and peace reign, this coworker makes snide comments to me that belittle me in the board meeting, right? No one thinks that. And it's sort of, without getting too much into it, and I'm not a theologian of evil or anything like this, but I just realized how that might sound like Machiavelli's teacher of evil. I don't mean to say that about myself, but sort of, I'm not a theologian on the subject of evil, but to sort of go beyond that, I feel like it's sort of just gravy on the mashed potatoes, right? It's just icing on the cake. Our experience tells us that something is deeply wrong when murder occurs, when theft occurs, when rape occurs, when the daily injustices of life rain down on us, right? And I think that's, in a sense, all most people need to move forward into a notion that the world is good, but is being perverted in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move. That's complex. So let's move. Let's kind of move on, because I think, I do think it's important. At least we got out the sense that being is good, the world is good, our nature is good, we're good, and then the other option is, well, maybe everything is neutral or even good, but we have to become like, what is the famous like Stuart Brand or something like, we're like gods, we better get used to it. Right, something to this effect. Bigger to become good at it. This is the other sense. This is in a sense, I don't know how I can not mean it pejoratively, but I don't mean it pejoratively in a sense. This is the attitude of Satan, right? Or maybe better, instead of the attitude of Satan, we can say this is the attitude of the builders of the Tower of Babel, right? Which I think is because, the Satan is like it's just intrinsically pejorative, right? So let's use the Towers of Babel instead. So I'll correct that and say that the contrast is, we have to do something. So a friend of mine, Rabbi Mitch Rocklin, makes this point where he says, if there's no covenant with God and man, then man has to do it all himself, right? And so it's almost like it is a rationalist and maybe not deeply reasonable, but understandable that we have to build the Tower of Babel. We have to build bricks and make a name for ourselves. And that would be the other side of the transhumanist argument and the technological perfection argument. And I mean, it's compelling, right? Mm-hmm. It's compelling. Do you think that's a correct maybe framing? Because you got those two parts. One, the kind of despair and everything's bad, nihilism. Second, Tower of Babel, we got to do it ourselves. Progress. And in a sense, what's the line? It's like, we have to stop thinking about eternity and start thinking about infinity. And it's time for us to right? I mean, I think it's a Deutsch, I think. What do you say to that? I mean, how do we think about that?
Yeah, I think the Tower of Babel is a good example. I think a lot of it is, it's rooted in a kind of, but again, it just goes back to this notion that, the people that build the tower look around and they say, let's fashion these bricks, let's build this tower up to the heavens so that we're not obliterated from the earth, right? Let's make something that outlasts us, right? Mm-hmm. But the only reason they think that is because their view is fundamentally, I don't know if I want to say atheistic, but it's fundamentally non-inclusive of a God that...
They're alone, we can say.
Yeah,
they're not in covenant, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, they're not in covenant, right? And, and it's the view of, I was just reading, I was in my prayer the other day, the Tower of Siloam, Jesus notes in the gospel. It's this really weird detail, but he says the 18 people.
Yeah, I thought that 18. Yeah.
The 18 people on which the Tower of Siloam fell, were they any worse than all the others who didn't die when the tower fell? No, of course not, right? That's what he says. But it's really not that. It's 18 people, right? God knows the 18 people intimately who were crushed by the Tower of Siloam when it fell, right? The people that built the Tower of Babel don't believe that anyone cares for them outside of other human beings, right? It's just, they're alone. They're not in covenant. God isn't there, or if he is, he hasn't made a covenant, or if he has, he doesn't really care that much about it, or even if he has made it and cares about it, it's not effective, or something like this, right? Mm-hmm. That's the fundamental problem. Mm-hmm. Self-reliance, it's pride, it's an exclusion of God from the world.
And then it comes to this question. Okay, so let's and then of course, I mean, like there's an exclusion of God from the world, and then in a sense, an empathetic sense, it's like we better do something, right? And I do think that actually does reflect the creative nature of God, right? But again, God has disappeared. So you have some stuff on like the intellectual development. You talk about Machiavelli. You talk about, in a sense, a movement to, how do you say, this idea of, man is the measure of all things, and an affirmation really of nature doesn't have any inner purpose, you say. And so it can be manipulated by people, but ultimately, and this follows C.S. Lewis, the people who manipulate are people with power over other people. And so there's a kind of a technocratic, the technocrats are the new priests, the scientists are the new priests. And so you argue that this is going to have effect on both elites and non-elites. But you make the case that it's non-elites that face the brunt of our technological paradigm's corrosive effects in the immediate term. And so you say there's two ways in which modern technology is going to affect, especially non-elites: liquidation and degradation. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so liquidation is, I think, the one that we're all basically familiar with. It's, like John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae talking about abortion, euthanasia, things like this. It's basically just the idea that the problem of humanity is solved by basically just eliminating the people that we want to eliminate, right? It's saying like, this child is inconvenient for me, so I'm going to not have it and, hire someone to destroy it in the womb. Or my elderly father is a real pain in the butt, so I'm going to have him, sort of liquidated, right, by someone with a medical degree. So that's the kind of standard picture, and I think and degradation is, I think, less talked about, but it's being increasingly more talked about.
Let's pause for just a second. So let me just push for you a second. You say it's non-elites who suffer this, but don't elites suffer that? I mean, if you think about elites, elites are getting abortions. Elites are practicing in vitro fertilization, right? So IVF technology, which means there's all these embryos that are being destroyed. That means their children are being destroyed. Whether they're cognitively aware of it, it's having clearly like psychological, spiritual effects, I think, on some people, and maybe on everybody. And so in a sense, elites are also, some elites are married and have children, they're okay. So they don't live what they necessarily preach. But I guess my point is, do you really think it's just the non-elites who are suffering this?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think the way that I was classifying it is it was a bit crude given the time I had to actually write it up and to actually speak it out in the conference. And I think a lot of these things intermingle, right? Obviously, non-elites can be subject to the same kinds of forces that we'll talk about when we talk about the elites as well. So I think there's definitely some intermixing between the two. But the way I was thinking of it was, in the same way that the elites they wait to have children until they're married, even though they tell everyone else to just have as much sex as they want. And they also, they practice something that would prevent them from conceiving as much as if they did it sort of quote unquote irresponsibly. So there's just less opportunities for those kinds of things for them, especially with like abortion. It's a kind of problem of people who are having lots of casual sex and not doing it in a way that prevents pregnancy from occurring, right? And I think the elites are better about, doing it quote unquote smartly. And I think that was the basic approach I was coming at it from, but it certainly affects everyone. We're all connected and we're all subject to these forces.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's right. I think I guess my kind of reaction to it was twofold. You've already explained part of it. Is that first what I said, like elites in many ways are in some ways the most impoverished in this area, right? It's almost like it's that famous line from C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man, where his friend is saying, he's dying from tuberculosis. He says, but we've got nature whacked, right? And there's this sadness to it. The elites are, you talk about prenatal blood tests. The elites are feeling this intense pressure. We can define what elites mean in a second, but people who say top 20 schools and graduate schools and professional degrees. There's an intense pressure on them from technology to make sure that they look perfect, that their diet is perfect. And then that when they're having children, it's almost like the Swedish theory of love. You don't have children by natural biological process. You have to technically create the children so that the children have the best chance of getting into the best schools so they can go to the best top universities. It seems to me, I guess, just I see your distinction, what you mean, and I see that point. In a sense, elites don't actually live the way they preach, but especially in this technological way, it's almost like they're almost under more of an inhumane regime than, say, lower middle class people who just don't have those pressures and technology put on them. Do you think I'm wrong?
No, I think that's right. And I think it's partially because, I mean, these things are trickling downwards and the elites are just closer to the top of the trickle. So it's hitting them first. Eventually it will trickle down and it will be, in the same way that, everyone had a TV by whatever year, but it was a luxury item prior to that. Eventually it will just trickle down and then, IVF will be, as cheap as, maybe not like as cheap as a Happy Meal, but, it'll be cheap enough that more people will have it, be able to access it.
Yeah. I mean, again, Lewis, he says relativism trickled down too, right? It used to be just a really thing. I guess, and my other thing, and you don't, not to push this too far, but I guess sometimes I worry a little bit, and I'm guilty of this myself, so that we've kind of created a demarcation of like elites and non-elites, and so elites just becomes kind of a pejorative. But we just read your bio and you're pretty elite. Right. You're definitely an elite. And so I wonder, like, are you trying to say something else? You've kind of intimated a little bit by saying people who don't live the way they preach, but like, I guess that's my word. I wonder if it's as helpful for us, and even in critiquing technology. So I'm both being maybe pedantic and annoying, but also asking a serious question, like maybe this elite language, which is very resonant with a certain type of political thing, maybe it's actually not the most helpful. Feel free to disagree with me.
I think, preliminarily, I'll just say the laws of appearing on a podcast prevent me from agreeing that you're pedantic and annoying. I'll
just cut you off. Yeah.
out of charity for that. I think that, it's possible that the distinction is not super helpful. And I suppose I would just refer you to whatever future work I might come up with that would collapse the distinction or clarify it in a way that's helpful.
I'm not trying to press you too much on it. It was just the second question was more like maybe rhetorical, like, is it helpful for us? The first one was really serious. Like, it seems like elites just are suffering a lot of this pressure. And I think you've answered that. So let's talk about, so the liquidation, right, is the visible one. We see it. Okay. And of course, the 20th century is a perfect example of liquidation of those people who were declared non-persons, right? And I've said this before, like, there's the people kind of, I think it's Iceland or something, like they brag, like, we have eradicated Down syndrome. Well, like, you didn't eradicate Down syndrome, you just killed everybody who has Down syndrome.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I'm bald, right? You can get rid of baldness by killing everybody who's bald, but that's not eradicating baldness. But that's the liquidation side. Why don't you talk about the degradation side? Because I think this goes to your first, like we talked about in the beginning at the Notre Dame conference, when you're saying, let's not just talk about dignity, let's talk about humanity, like that we're being degraded as humans. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the way I put it in the article is it's basically just a sort of, it's the bread and circuses of the 21st century, essentially, is what we're dealing with. So the Romans offered bread and circuses to the people to distract them in the Colosseum, so that they could go about whatever they were trying to do, securing power, conquest, whatever. When everything was collapsing, at least there were bread and circuses, right? And I think that's it's an apt, I think, comparison. A lot of things are collapsing around us. We have incompetence abroad. With Afghanistan withdrawal, we have, massive inflation. It's probably just going to get worse. We have collapsing birth rates. People are not getting married. And our political system is sclerotic at best and just a complete joke at worst, right? There's all kinds of problems, and they could be, someone more pessimistic than me could spin out even more off the top of his head. But I think that's a good partial list. And the degradation is basically just lowering us. It's sort of degrading what's distinctly human about us, in particular, our capacity for reason, our capacity to experience the divine in moments of silence, right? This is like the kind of degradation that crowds out authentically human ways of existing in the world and relating to God, right? And, I'm not going to pretend that it's sort of a trite point. I think everyone trots it out when they talk about these things. I'm not going to pretend like it's not great that grandma can keep up with her grandkids on Facebook, right? That's, I suppose, a self-evident good if you're going to do that. You might wonder why people don't just live closer to their relatives so that they can just see their grandchildren instead of looking at them on Facebook. But those
they
are
can
maybe,
sometimes, right?
Right. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they live 500 miles away for some indiscernible reason, right? It's like just the narrative of just, leave home and succeed, right? Just leave everything you've known and go get a degree, as though that's like a sufficient replacement for family, right? So we might question that. But even where technology is a good, like I mentioned in the article, in the essay, like Google Maps, when it works precisely as we intend it to work, something that's part of being human, and obviously some humans do it better than others, but a sort of sense of where I am in the world, just physically, like as a matter of latitude and longitude, like where am I and how do I go to the place I want to go, is something that's sort of robbed from us. In addition to our attention and all these other things, we become lost in our own world, which I think contributes to a sense that the world is this hostile place, right? I don't know where I am. When you don't know where you are, it's like when you wake up from a long nap and you're not sure where you are, you might immediately think potentially that there's might be a threat. Like, I don't know where I am. I need to like be aware of my surroundings as I come to, right? Google Maps, I think, makes us strangers in our own world. It's not to say that I'm going to give up Google Maps. I mean, it would take a process of me becoming, acclimated to my world, learning, how to get from point A to point B. It's going to require memory on my part to remember how to go places instead of just letting it direct me. And so I can think about other things when I'm driving. So there's benefits, but there's, I think, downsides that we don't tend to think about very much, if at all, or very clearly. And I think that's one of them. Sometimes technology, when it does exactly what it's supposed to do, just undermines humanity.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, so I mentioned I wrote this little book called Digital Contagion. And so, I argued, like, obviously there's many benefits. Like, I mean, we're having a podcast. I can actually see you, right? I mean, it's great. It's just, there's a lot of benefits. And of course, there's incredible medical advances and it's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, and there are things going wrong, right? There's Jared Lanier, who I interviewed on the podcast, talks about behavior modification, right? He says we're all lab animals now. We're kind of being modified. We don't realize it. There's what Shosan Zuboff called surveillance capitalism. We're constantly being watched, and not just watched, but watched and manipulated, right? Like it's a Skinner box. Obviously there's debates about cancel culture, but there's also, I think, like a hardening of things. I mean, look, both of us are Catholic. You're Chaldean. I am Latin. We're both Catholic. We're both conservatives. We both went to Notre Dame. Okay. Right. I for undergraduate, you for law school. And there's all these things. But like, if we didn't talk right now and I read something about you, or you read something that I said, I mean, we could get on Twitter and just unload on each other.
Right.
Right. I mean, like, and so the thing is, be like, that Dion guy's the biggest jerk, whatever. Right. And then we talk to each other and like, oh, and we have all these like things in common, and I mean, we know people and we take, and so like, in a sense, I think that's another, like the Marshall McLuhan says that the medium is the message. I mean, I think that's another thing that's hardening, that we already tend, it's in the book of Genesis when God says to Eve, you shall desire your husband and he will lord it over you, that we tend towards objectification. We objectify the other, and we objectify people who don't look like us. We objectify people who are poor. We objectify, men objectify women, women objectify men, et cetera. And that the technology further exacerbates this objectification, right? It's a disembodiment. And I think that's another, real problem. And you talk about this. I mean, we've also this negative impact on our mental and spiritual health. I mean, we're constantly connected. You linked to some things talking about this. Nothing we do is private. We feel like we're being watched. Obviously, we're seeing serious problems like Jean, I think you say Twenge has written her book, iGen, right? She's like, how widespread use of smartphones is linked to depression, loneliness, less satisfaction with life, right? Obviously, serious problems with video games and pornography. I talk about the effects of that, especially pornography, with Mary Eberstadt in her book, Primal Screams. People are suffering, okay? And here, in a sense, I think maybe not, the elite, non-elite thing starts to work a little bit. I think everybody's affected by it, elites and non-elites, as you talk about yourself being affected by it. But then in another sense, it does become, and feel free to correct me or develop or whatever, maybe the non-elite, elite distinction actually does start to have some real importance, because we're all kind of suffering from the effects of digital technology that we don't know how to deal with yet, right? And it doesn't mean that digital technology is all bad. It's just like, we got to learn to deal with it. Like James Poulos in a podcast, he says like, and he's like, everybody keeps worrying about what's going to happen. He's like, the apocalypse already did happen. Okay. I mean, like, we got to now learn how to deal with it. Right. So that's where it's general, but it's also in a sense used as a political tool by the ruling factions, right or left, to in a sense, anesthetize, control, placate the masses. And that's a short-term win for maybe real long-term disaster. I think you're trying to get to that. And maybe I've misread you, but what do you say?
No, I mean, it's a fair point. I think the one thing I would emphasize that I think is worth repeating often and regularly. Thomas Sowell said, I think it was in his book about elites. I'm blanking on the name, but he says something like, there are no solutions to problems. There's only trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And I think in a serious way, I mean, obviously I propose a kind of solution in the second part of the essay, and I think it is a kind of solution, but it really is a trade-off, because to embrace it is to mean certain things are off the table, right? So we've traded one thing for another. We've said being human is good. We're going to live in this religious mode, but we're not going to have Clark Kent's walking among us, right? It's just not we're just going to foreclose that possibility. And I think, yeah, the elites everyone's affected by it, but you have these things like you were saying with the mental and spiritual damage that's being done. You have the internal study from, I guess it would be Meta now that did the internal study. It used to be Facebook on Instagram's effect on teenage girls and how it increases thoughts of suicide just by being on it for girls, teenage girls. So that's a serious problem. And then, obviously elites are insulated to a degree because
they have families.
They have families, but Mark Zuckerberg doesn't let his kids use tablets and Facebook. Yep. They prevent their kids from doing that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I write about that in the Digital Contagion book. I mean, like a lot of it, like, oh, we don't want our children. So I always tell my children, like, because they're on like our phones. Like it's, I tell them they're cyborgs. But we don't give our children, like our 18-year-old, but anybody younger, there's no phones. And so I say, I'm like a Google executive without the money.
Right.
You can't have, I mean, but I mean, it doesn't mean technology is like, it's just there anyway. Even meme culture, like my wife and I talk about this, like I'm older than you are, Dion, but like I didn't have to deal with constant memes that were just fed to me that are actually shaping my like thought in a disordered or at least guided way. I mean, I think the challenges are really big and we have to learn to deal with them better. And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I think you do have a couple things that I want to get to. And this is where you really start to move into, like, in a sense, the elite challenges. And that's the challenge of transhumanism, right? And this also has effect on everybody as well, especially in the subset of transhumanism, which is transgenderism, which we'll talk about. But let's maybe go into that. Let's talk about that before we go to your religious response. Let's talk about the problem or the challenge, the temptation of transhumanism. You say, we come to the elites who have become obsessed with transcending their humanity. Okay. They want to leave their humanity behind. Okay. And transgenderism is just the tip of the transhumanist project spear. And so why don't you talk about transhumanism? What is it? Because some people will be like, okay, I'm not exactly sure what it is. I mean, I've talked about it on the podcast before, but let's talk about transhumanism. What is it? What do you think the sources are? And then we can also talk about transgenderism and how it's a subset of it.
Sure. Yeah. It's, there's all kinds of websites of transhuman, I think there might even be there was once a transhuman candidate running for something in Australia. I think, there's like websites that discuss it, and it's one of those things it's just like a slippery, it's like, what is conservatism? Like, you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different definitions, but it's basically the notion that there's something wrong with the way we are and we could be better. And the metric along which we'd be better is always some kind of materialist metric, right? We can be smarter, we can be faster, we can be stronger, we can be more beautiful, right? So it's basically just the view that there's something wrong with us and we can move beyond it. So I use the term post-humanism. I think that's it's a little bit less confusing. It's sort of, after humanity, right? Something like that. After, we become something different, what will we be? Something that's not human, but sort of has some kind of recognizable, maybe like root in humanity, right? We can sort of maybe still see it. The sources of it, yeah, I mean, Francis Bacon didn't make it into the essay. He was in the speech, but he didn't make it into the essay on public discourse. But I mean, there's a kind of fusion there's a kind of Baconism is a kind of applied Machiavellianism, basically. It's like Machiavellianism for technology. So you have this sense that
Once you explain that, just go ahead and explain that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, Machiavellianism is basically just, the ends justify the means. And that's because the standard of right and wrong has been ejected, because what matters is the effectual truth, right? What we see around us, the world as it is. We don't get into ideal theory. We just deal with the world as it is, right? People are corrupt. People do corrupt things. They seek after power. How do we build a world on that basis? And when the moral constraints have been sort of ejected from public life and even from private life to a degree, and all that we're left with, and what fills the vacuum when there's no superintending moral law to sort of constrain the will of the powerful, inevitably what fills its place is the will of the powerful, right? It becomes a matter of will and not reason and reflection and intellect, right? So it's just whatever the powerful want. Whoever the powerful happen to be at that time get what they want. And that's the standard, right? The Melian dialogue, right? The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's what the Athenians say to the island of Melos, right? As they're about to attack it. So that's basically what Machiavellianism gives us. Bacon basically he's one of the few people, I think he's maybe the only one, I think Harvey Mansfield talks about this, who actually cites Machiavelli in his work. Everyone else avoided him because it was like the teacher of evil. Like, I don't want to be associated with that guy. But Bacon just embraces it. He cites Machiavelli. He talks about the application of his project to technology. And because the moral gaze has been lowered, because the ethics, the anthropology has been ejected, the moral law is gone, the law of nature and nature's God no longer has any force, what you get is a focus on health, right? It's basically just how do we live materially better? That's what Bacon is giving us, right? And so I think that's like the basic tracing of how you get to where we are with this. And transgenderism is, like you said, as a subset of transhumanism. I think it's the first. I use the analogy of the camel's nose in the tent, right? It's poked its way in. It's societally acceptable, and if you don't accept it, you're canceled. And it's a very clear kind of post-human move. I mean, people are men and women, right? They're male and female. Mm-hmm. To say that I can be something that I'm not, right? My body tells me that I'm one or the other sex. There's two sexes. I'm something different, and I can make it so, right? Or maybe even not. Maybe just that I've always been something different. They're equivocal on their language that they use. Sometimes they say, I'm a man who became a woman. I was a man, I'm now a woman, or I've always been a woman and I'm just expressing it, right? There's this kind of equivocation on the language, probably because the thought that it comes from is very unclear as well. But, and Mark Barnes at New Polity has complicated this with his PhD dissertation that he wrote, that he's talking about on the podcast on gender over at New Polity. He sort of questions the reductive biological view, and I don't know that it's necessary to get into all that kind of detail, but basically the body says something. Maybe it doesn't say everything, but the body says something critical about who we are. And to reject that and say I'm actually this other thing, or I've always been this other thing, is a post-human move. It's a post-human shift that has become societally acceptable ever since 2015, right? When Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner, said, "Call me Caitlyn." And it's becoming more and more, accepted. It's becoming more and more entrenched as time goes on. And it's the first step in a post-human direction. It's the political delivery mechanism of this kind of movement beyond humanity.
Okay, explain that more. People would say, well, what do you mean? It's the delivery mechanism for post-humanism. Explain that a bit more.
It's the instantiation of the technological gaze in a politically salient way, right? It's the instantiation of the notion that I can apply radical forms of technology to my body to transform it into something that it's not, right? I can do aggressive intervention. I can destroy natural function. I'm not restoring natural function. I'm actually destroying natural function, right? It's as far-fetched as saying, I believe I'm blind and I want my doctor to blind me to align my body with what I believe about myself inside, right? I mean, I think any doctor who would do that would be rightly stripped of his license and excoriated and never practice medicine again, right? But we have whole institutions, media, medical associations, individual doctors, psychiatrists that push this as though it's normal. It's the radical alteration of received humanity in service of some kind of, what would you say, like autonomous remaking of the self, basically. Mm-hmm. It's post-humanity. I mean, that's what you're making yourself into something that you're not.
Right. It's escaping. I mean, I think there's a lot of sources to it. One of them, I think, is Gnostic in a sense of a Manichaean, like we're bad, we have to escape. I think that's one of them. I don't know if you know the work of Carl Stern, his excellent book, Flight from Woman. It's blow your mind. Read the book. But I mean, he kind of, I think there's also a flight from woman. Even like a lot of girls are becoming transgender. You know, Mary Eberstadt talks about this. So that's the flight from woman from the woman. And then in a sense, it looks like a flight to woman for the man. But in many ways, it's the appropriation of woman.
Yeah.
Right. So that it's a rejection. So I think there's actually a deep, maybe inarticulate disdain for the female and for motherhood and for biological motherhood. I also think you said something, there's a lot of equivocation of language around this. And I've talked about this before and talked, lectures on this, but part of it is I think there's a new ontology of the person that's being written into law. And I want to get to law with you in a minute because you're a lawyer and I'm not. But I think that you're seeing, for example, I said there's inversions going on. Like instead of having an essence, a kind of thing that you are, some nature, and then you exist, now you have this radical, undetermined existence, and you can determine your essence through your sexual predilection. Now, it's incoherent, okay, how you're able to choose a thing. But that's really being written into law, this new ontology of the person, where your sexual predilection, actually, your choice of sexual predilection determines who you are. And thereby, that's your dignity. And it's a violation of dignity because you, Dion, you might be a Catholic and you hold certain things. But if someone declares themselves to be a man who declares himself to be a woman, if you're not respecting that, then you're committing a violation of that person's dignity. Right. And this is like being written into law as we speak. So, but I think that's also why there's an equivocation of language, because I think it's kind of all over the place in order to get this. Okay. So that's the post-human connected to the transgender. You make this point that there's another path, right? Mm-hmm. Or I guess this is you say there's two paths of transhumanism, right? So that's one of them. I'm trying to go back to your work here.
Yeah. We have like sort of
you talk about the CRISPR side.
Yeah.
Again, how would you like that? Is that one path, or is that a subset? Like where does like the whole CRISPR thing? That would be the same path, right? The transgenderism and the post-human and CRISPR technology and gene editing would be one path of transhumanism.
Yeah, the way I see it is the transgender movement, worldview, ideology is the gateway to these other pathways, right? It's the first step, it's the first move, the first transition into this kind of post-humanism. And the two paths are basically, we sort of, this is why I think the Gnosticism is maybe not quite right, because mm-hmm. One of the paths is we lean into the body, right? We enhance it, we make it smarter, we make it more beautiful, we make it faster, stronger, right? All these things. We lean into that and we become as close as we can to supermen on Earth, right? Nietzsche and Übermenschen basically is that path. And that's like where you get things like CRISPR. Basically, the analogy to CRISPR is just that I think a reasonable definition of a superhuman, at least in the near term, is someone for whom the laws of nature don't apply, at least as to their bodily constitution, right? So something like preventing HIV from occurring to a person is a kind of rejection of the natural consequences of how one contracts HIV, right? That's the example that I use. So, I mean, it's not as flashy.
That actually does that. If I'm not mistaken, there are some people who are naturally resistant to HIV. Right?
Okay.
As the retro, I think so. I could be wrong on that. And happy listener, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm quite certain that there are some people who are naturally resistant to getting the HIV virus, right? The retrovirus. Okay. So, but I think the point here that you're making is what happened with CRISPR technology and what was done by a Chinese scientist. What's his name? Sorry, I'm in a mind blank.
He Jiankui, I think.
Yeah, He Jiankui. Yeah. So I think what you're talking about here is 2018, there was a biophysicist named He Jiankui who announced that he and his lab had actually edited the genome. They did a genetic editing of 2 twin girls in embryo and made them resistant to infection by HIV. And it's germline editing that is actually passed down to future generations. Okay, so he was sentenced to Chinese court to 3 years in prison. And Jennifer Doudna actually talks about this, right? She's one of the founders of CRISPR. She's like, I was really starting to get worried about this. Then she gets this note. And I believe those twin girls have been born. So the question, of course, are like, we don't know what the off-target effects of that are going to be in long term. We don't know. But also, let me be a bit dark here. I mean, think about this in a post-human way, especially where women are commodified because they're just matter. So, well, if you can make girls who are resistant to HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases and sterile, you can create, in a sense, like what Blade Runner replicants, right? You're essentially creating, I mean, they're actual human beings, but you're creating these, you're in a sense modifying women to be simply used as objects for men. I mean, It's a very dark direction here. And so that's your concern, right? Not that in this manipulation, you're trying to go post-human and millions of people, let's say, if we do this, are going to be, in a sense, experimented on, right? And so again, what we're doing is we're taking people who don't have a voice, unborn children, and or future generations, and experimenting on them, which is very different from, say, somatic, where you're engaging with someone in a therapeutic manner.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. It's the experimentation, and it's like you quoted a couple of times with Lewis, you know, some men become masters over other men as you do the germline editing, because it's just the ones at, you know, time zero do the experiment, and then they've affected everyone after that. Right. So I think that's part of it. But the other part of it too is, you know, obviously, like, you know, for example, I mean, I think what I mean to say is a lot of the things we experience as hindrances are actually helpful when they're properly conceptualized. So, I mean, I think a lot of us at some point or another, usually after we stub our toe against the leg of the couch, have thought, if only I just couldn't feel pain, it would be great, right? I could just do anything. But there are people who don't experience pain, and it's really painful for them, actually, because they just shred their bodies and they don't feel it, right? They do all these things and they don't feel it. So what I mean to be saying is, imagine we could create someone, you know, who doesn't experience some emotion, right? Because we think that this emotion is just useless, or it, you know, on balance holds us back, right? We lose valuable information about the world. We lose something about our humanity when we lose that. So, I mean, it's not just that some people might be resistant to HIV and some people aren't, right? It's that these things that happen to us, you know, it's like Mark Barnes has talked about with the punishments of the Old Testament, right? He talks about how he always used to think that they were just kind of like extrinsic punishments. Like, if you disobey the law of God, then this other nation will arrive and conquer you, right? It's not that they're extrinsic, like do A and then B occurs, but there's no necessary connection between the two. They actually arise from the act itself. Like he talks about the census, like you're not supposed to have a detailed count of the people, right? And that when you do that, you make the people into a mass, which makes them susceptible to like a famine or these other kinds of things where they can just be rounded up and exterminated, right? Like they become countable, which has a necessary consequence. It's not that God says, oh, you did a census, so I'm going to do X, and it's not connected, right? So these kinds of
plague, he's arguing that the 3-day plague isn't random. It's connecting. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a necessary connection between the sin and the consequences of the sin, right? Like, it's like the wages of sin is death. It's not just circumstantial. It's not just like God said, oh, they sinned, I guess it'll be death then, versus like some other thing, right? It's like that is the way meal. Right? Or a happy meal, right? That's the way reality is. So when we start tinkering with like the substrates of it, I guess you could say, I mean, it's not the deepest level because there's spiritual stuff, but when you start tinkering with that stuff, you change the whole world, and there
are consequences that are unpredictable, which brings us back to that naive interventionism.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm not sure who said this. I was maybe just listening to it, but you know, this point of like, there are people who have been great artists or scientists, thinkers, who maybe had disorders autism or bipolar or some type of maybe psychiatric problem. And from that pain and suffering gave us deep insight into the human condition, that we all maybe suffered not at the same depth that they did, but they were able to create some beautiful poetry or music that speaks to the heart of man, that is redemptive. And so in a sense, we have a perfectionism that wants to eradicate all of these things and may well be eradicating humanity in the process.
Right.
And I think it also asks, like, who says what the perfectionism is? And you've kind of alluded to this earlier. I mean, it's a very kind of sterile humanitarian health vision, as opposed to a broader vision of like what human flourishing looks like, and in the context of where we take goodness and truth and beauty and suffering, and what does Carter Snead say, that the uncalculated grace of giving and receiving and helping one another. I mean, you know, and again, back to the Snead point, the expressive individualism is written into law, and it's actually an expressive individualism of a certain kind of humanitarian, sterile power that equals perfectionism. But maybe the child with Down syndrome is the greatest gift a family has had. And I've talked to people who've said that. You know, maybe taking care of your elderly parents, while difficult at times, is a way for you and for your children to live out a richer understanding of what it means actually to be human. And so it's this again, reiterating this Lewis part, it's not just the editing, it's actually who decides. I talk about this with like algorithms, right? Like the algorithm is written by somebody,
right?
And then it's interpreted by somebody, right? So somebody's deciding what we're going to write, and somebody's going to write what it means, and then we're going to use it on you. It's not science, right? It's not technology simply. It's a vision of the human person. And I think, if I'm hearing you, this is what you're getting to.
Yeah, and there's a kind of just because I can't divorce any of this conversation from the religious and the spiritual, because it's just inextricably intertwined with it. But
can I pause you for a second? Sorry, I want you to go to that because that's at the end. So don't forget what you're going to say. I just want you to say one thing so we don't kind of. You said you don't think Gnosticism is part of it, or you don't think it's all of it? Like, can you just explain that? Because I think a lot of people would say there's a certain Manichaeanism going on here.
Yeah.
So before, and I'm sorry, but I know you end with this religious element, so I want to get there at the end, but I didn't want to say, oh, and by the way, let's talk about Gnosticism. So
no, sure. So I think like Robbie George has an article at First Things I think it's called Gnostic Liberalism, might have been a few years ago, where he makes this argument that you're seeing a kind of resurgence of Gnosticism with things like transgenderism. And I take his point. It's a good one. But I think because we have this I think it would be one thing if the only thing we saw were the desire to, as I talk about in the essay, to kind of meld with the singularity, right? To sort of reject the body and just sort of leave it in this like vat, so that we can like experience the utopia of the digital world that we can create, right? With our own imagination. I would say that's like very clearly Gnosticism, right? Like my body is terrible and I'm going to leave it behind and just live in the world of the mind, right?
Like uploading your consciousness, like the singularity.
Yeah.
And also, what about the metaverse?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I would say both of those things. If that were the only data we had, I'd say Robbie George is right. This is Gnosticism. I'm wrong about, the kind of technological gaze aspect of it. But I think because we have the desire to enhance our bodies, because that's part of the thread, Gnosticism can't be the only part of it, because a Gnostic would not want to enhance his body. He would want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. He thinks of it as a prison, right?
Right. Okay. So you've got kind of, you're arguing not necessarily that Robbie George is wrong, that there's not Gnosticism, but that only articulates or explains part of what's going on. There's also what I'll call the Tower of Babel mentality of the technocrat. You think that's right?
Yeah. I think it's a fusion of both, but they're sort of separable at the level of which track you want to go on. Which track?
Yeah. You can choose. You got Tower of Babel, you got Gnostic, it's like a video game. And
full luxury Gnosticism or full luxury technocracy. Yeah, that's basically the path.
Okay. I mean, I'm laughing. It's pretty depressing, but all right. Okay. So thank you for that. No, that's really helpful. So you were saying, and this is where you end your essay too, like you can't separate it from the religious. And we kind of went to that and coming back to that. So why don't you talk about that? Because I think that's part of your argument, that like we're in a religious debate, and so we have to affirm religion. And again, feel free at any moment also to talk about how you think the law has a place in this, because you're not simply arguing we need a religious revival, which you are, right? Mm-hmm. But we also need to also protect the innocent from injustice, right? We need a religious revival, and correct me if I'm putting any words in your mouth, but also technocrats are experimenting their transgenderism on innocent children. And that should also be prohibited, right? So am I getting you right?
Yeah, I make the point that not everyone is going to agree, but that's no surprise. We've never had 100% agreement on anything, I think maybe ever in human history. So we don't need unanimity. What we need is determined majorities who I believe firmly still exist. I mean, we're not so far gone that we can't muster up a majority to say we shouldn't experiment on children to create post-humans.
But even I would say, even if we don't have a determined majority, we need responsible adults writing laws that protect children, even if the majority want to experiment on them.
Right. So we need, we would need some maybe courageous legislators who would be willing to be unseated to pass such a law or something like this if we didn't have majorities. But I think we, in many places, have majorities and we should use them. We should tap into them because people are responding to something very deep here. I mean, they sense that something is happening. They sense it in a way I think we didn't see it with something like same-sex marriage, right? They sense that there's something more dangerous potentially is at stake with the transgender debate, right? I think they're picking up on that. So we don't need unanimity. We just need determination to write into law the vision for the world that we want to see. And that's not some spooky Catholic integralism about morality and law. I mean, law embodies morality. Every law at some level embodies morality. Like when we say you're not going to go over 70 on the freeway, it's because we've made the moral decision that 70 is fast enough, balanced against how many people will die if it's faster, and the benefits of getting places more quickly than 60. Right? We've made a moral decision on that front. So
I say always, law is the legislation of morality.
Yes, that's all law is.
That's what law is. Yeah.
Right. At some level, I mean, the finer details of it, like what size paper you're supposed to print whatever on to submit it is not, it's just a kind of prudential choice. But the structure of the law is moral, right? There's no escaping that.
Right. So you're not arguing for any type of theocracy here or integralism, you said. Keep going.
Yeah, I mean, if someone wants to tar me as a theocrat for saying we shouldn't experiment on children, I'm happy to accept the label, and I'm sure many people would join me in accepting that label. But it would just be a straw man to call me a theocrat. I would call it reasonable and what everyone believed up until 5 minutes ago. And I think I stand on pretty solid ground in the tradition and in my own society. But yeah, law is good, law is necessary, but law is not enough. Law derives its force, vitality, effect from people believing that the law serves their interests and that the law is good, right? We got same-sex marriage because people stopped believing in what marriage was. It's just that simple. And we will lose the debate unless we infuse the law with the pre-legal premises that allow the law to be effective. That's why the law will work. It's because people believe that it's good for them and that it's just and that it's moral. Not just moral in the sense descriptively, but that it's good, right? That's what they're looking for. And that's where religion comes in. Yeah, I mean, like Lewis talks about the axioms, those sort of immovable axioms that, when they're moved, they unleash chaos, basically, because we're sort of trying to find something deeper than the axioms themselves, which is not possible to do. One of those axioms, I think, is being human is good. And I think being human is good, not just self-evidently because it's all we know. I mean, what would it mean to not be human? It's like we're sawing off the branch we're sitting on in a certain way to reject our own humanity. It's all we know, right? It's like Thomas Nagel has a famous philosophy article called What is it like to be a bat, I think, where it's like, if I were a bat, what would it be like? And we can think about it, but we're always thinking about it as a human being sitting inside of a bat, right? Like, what does it mean to echolocate, actually? All I can know is it's something like seeing with sound, but that's exactly what a human being would say, right? I mean, what does it mean to be a bat? I don't really know. So what does it mean to be post-human? We're not really going to know until it happens, and by then it'll be too late, right? So religion is, I call it the virtue of religion. There's a kind of way of speaking about it where it's the virtue of basically justice toward God. It's giving God his due, right? It's giving God his due means recognizing that he's God and we're not.
Mm-hmm.
He's God, we're creatures. He's God who created us. He's God who created us and declared us very good when he did so. And he's God that looked upon our humanity in the person of Jesus Christ, took it on, was born of a woman, lived as we live, suffered so that he could redeem us, he did not reject humanity. He made it and became one of us. I mean, there's no better argument than that for that human being and human beings is in our good.
Yeah, well, and I said this. I give a lecture at Acton Institute's summer conference, Acton University, which is great. You should all come to it. And the first lecture, it's the foundational lecture of we have sometimes. Before COVID, we had about 1,000 people from 70 countries come. And there's like 100 lectures to choose from. And the first lecture, which I give, is the Christian vision of the human person. Because if you don't get the human person right, everything, all your other political and social questions don't make any sense. And so I kind of go through these 7 aspects of what it means to be a human being, the characteristics of the person. But one that's really, really important is that we have an eternal destiny. But our eternal destiny, we get our bodies back. There's a resurrection of the body. And I think, and I talked about this on the podcast with James Poulos. This is part of the creed. It's the Nicene Creed, that we believe in the resurrection of the dead. So this is essential in the Jewish and Christian tradition, that the body is not something to escape from, right? The body is good. And I think that's a really important point, that God declares the world good, our bodies good, and we get our bodies back at the end, right? And I think that is really a powerful vision of embodiment and why embodiment is good. So let's continue though, because you make this case. You say the best way to avoid this posthumanist fate, or maybe trap, I'm not sure if we can become posthuman, but you say, you were talking about recommit to the virtue of religion, giving God his due, justice, okay, the goodness of the human person, the goodness of our embodied and souled organism that we are. And then you say, we accept like in a sense, we live in the world and accept that we're stewards. And you say, when we're steeped in a religious mode of being, we're content to just be human. So we don't have to grasp for more. And that doesn't mean we're content to be where we are, right? You obviously mean we're kind of called to what the East calls theosis, right? And the West calls deiformity, like to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. So we have a theological direction towards this. But go into this, you talk a little bit about that. What do you mean, I guess, by this, a little bit more on this sense of this virtue of religion and living embodied lives?
Sure. I mean, I'm taking my jumping off point, from like the liturgy itself. The liturgy is, I mean, there's different seasons and all these other things, but the liturgy just repeats. I mean, it's offered every day, sometimes, multiple times a day. It spirals upwards. It's an upward spiral that becomes deeper as you spiral. The more you enter into it, the more depth there is. It's a kind of, it's a burrowing spiral, but that's not to connote that it's like negative. It's burrowing down.
I actually have just sort of keep going, but I actually did a podcast with David Clayton a while ago called Beauty in the Cosmos, and he talks about this spiral element. So please keep going. I think it's
sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's basically the image that I take my jumping off. Right. I use
explain that to someone who doesn't understand what you mean, like by the liturgy and just a little bit. I mean, you don't have to go into the depths, but just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's the liturgy, it's the liturgical seasons, it's the disciplines we have in each season. I mean, so we're in Lent right now, and I think for a while I used to think, when I was younger, before I had my sort of return to the faith, before college, I used to think, we're just repeating the same dang things over and over again. It's just like, give up something for Lent, do a little bit more prayer, then Easter comes, and then it's Christmas, Advent and Christmas and Ordinary Time and all these other things. But it's to think that way, I think, is understandable when you're maybe 16 or something. But once you realize that life just is a kind of cycle of deepening meaning, it makes a lot more sense why we go to Mass every Sunday at least, right? It's a little bit hard to kind of get at, but you just sort of continually till the ground, and you keep, to your shock and surprise, you find that there's yet more beauty beneath what you're tilling, right? It's sort of amazing. And that's what I think of as the liturgy, and that's what I think of as this religious mode of being, right? It's like I live these grooves that I make in the world. That's like the water going down the rock. It makes a groove, and you sort of deepen the groove. And when there's grooves that are causing you pain, like sin, you try to direct the force in a different direction with God's help, and you try to drop some rocks in that opening so that the water doesn't keep going down that groove. And then eventually you have a nice set of grooves that make up a life, and your life is just all these moments stacked up that have taken on more and more meaning the more you've reflected on them and offered them back to God, and he's given them to you, right? And to sort of live out more fully each turn of the liturgical calendar, each mass, right? You sort of are sent out, renewed and strengthened to do what he's asking you to do and giving you the grace to do when you leave. And it just keeps getting deeper and deeper until eventually, you're living in the Trinity itself at the end of time. I mean, that's what it's a recognition that our lives are given to us, that we are creatures, and that it's a gift. It's a free gift that God offers, and it's a good gift, and we should embrace it.
Mm-hmm. And you're not denying, obviously, the reality of suffering, but that suffering too has meaning because we're human. And how would you articulate? How would you respond to the question of suffering in that point?
No, I was actually going to try to find a way to force us over there if you didn't ask it. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
But yeah,
you didn't even pay me for it. It was totally free.
Exactly. It's your testament to your interviewing skills. Yeah,
and I didn't pay you for that. So see, it's
no, absolutely not.
Mutual benefit of trade.
No, this has been great so far. No. So suffering is really important because I think it's like it's the key argument, I think, against Christianity in a certain way. It's like
and Judaism.
Yeah, and Judaism, right? It's
yeah. Well, and I would say, just correct me, I'm jumping in here, but sorry, I thought about this. It's also the thing that the Tower of Babel and the Gnostics want to avoid. I mean, that's a shared, like, okay, whether you're Gnostic or you've got to get away from suffering.
Right.
And the Jewish and Christian tradition doesn't say, suffering's great. I mean, obviously it's a problem. And we've been talking about Lewis a lot. So he talks about how he doesn't want suffering, but that suffering has meaning because it's part of our sacrifice and giving of self, right? But yes. I'll let you talk about suffering. But I just thought, it struck me like, oh, yeah, right. That's the Gnostics and then in the Tower of Babel, both of the post-human world, part of it's a rejection of suffering. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think, and it's totally understandable that people reject suffering. I mean, it's
absolutely. I hate suffering. Part
of the word, right? You don't want to suffer because it's unpleasant, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point. But if your listeners will forgive, a 20-something talking about suffering as though he knows what he's talking about.
You don't, but neither do I.
Yeah, fair enough. I'll just launch into it. I've been thinking about this.
I was just teasing you. Go ahead. You may. I don't know you.
I talk about this I think I might have sent you this essay. It was on my Substack about euthanasia. There's this guy, Scott Alexander, who writes he used to write at Slate Star Codex.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's really smart. I found him when I was in college, and I just kind of fell in love with just how methodical he was in his writing. And he's just so good. He's so knowledgeable. But he has this article about just the reality of what death looks like in America, basically. I mean, I think he's a psychiatrist somewhere in Michigan, potentially. But I don't know if he moved after he got married. But he just writes about how people think they're going to die in their own bed. They're going to be lucid, maybe in a moderate amount of pain with all their family around them. And it's going to be this nice little send off as they go, into their eternal destiny. Right. But in reality, people die, at least in his experience in the hospital. And he concedes that maybe he just has a bad sample of people, but his experience is people die incoherent, in a lot of pain, not knowing where they are, without any family, and sort of terrified, screaming whenever anyone comes into the room to administer medicine because they have no idea where they are and they think it's going to hurt, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredibly bleak picture of what death looks like. And I understand fully why euthanasia looks like an attractive option. It's like, of like the big social issues, it's the one that I find most tempting to endorse, frankly. It's sort of just something about the description of that sort of intensified it for me. And I've maintained for a while that the only response to euthanasia is an authentically Christian understanding of suffering. Because there's no argument other than that will defeat the euthanasia debate. I mean, it's just not possible to do. But to get to suffering specifically, suffering is, Father Walter Ciszek talks about in this book, He Leadeth Me. In his book, he was a communist prisoner he was in the Siberian labor camps and solitary confinement in communist Russia for, I think, like 19 years. And he talks about suffering a lot in that book. And the point he makes is that, he talks about how seeking the will of God is not this like thing that's out there beyond us that we sort of try to figure out, right? The will of God is the concrete circumstances of our life right now. So when suffering comes, it's not that it's some kind of obstacle that prevents us from getting to God or some inconvenience. In reality, suffering is, just like everything else that happens, a gift from a God who loves us. And this is not something you say to someone in certain circumstances, right? When they've just lost a brother or a job or something like this. It's maybe not well received, but suffering is a gift. It's actually the cross that Jesus tells us to carry is not just like the punishments from our sin, it's not some extrinsic imposition that God just decided would be, this is the cross that you have, right? Like you've lost your brother and your job and maybe now you have cancer, right? That isn't the point. The cross we're given is actually fashioned by God on purpose for you in particular. That is the cross that when you've carried it all the way to the gates, unlocks the gate. Like it's a personal key of your sanctification. It's not an extrinsic imposition. It's not an inconvenience. It's not something that, maybe the devil had some hand in it, but he's working inside of providence, right? I mean, it's really the case that your suffering is a true gift to you in particular. So that would be my response to anyone who would sort of question, I sort of forget what your question was, but whether suffering is an answer or a response to this kind of worldview I'm laying out. I think it's not. I actually think it plays directly into the entire cosmology of it. Actually, it's an indispensable portion of it. It's necessary to suffer.
Yeah, and I think, this goes to your point, ultimately, that what we're dealing with is a religious, 2 or 3, 4 religious competing visions of the world. And that what you're arguing, and I think it's right out of the Jewish and Christian tradition, is this affirmation of the goodness of being, affirmation of the goodness of creation, affirmation of the goodness of the human being, and that even suffering has purpose and meaning. And part of that's because it's connected to what freedom is for, right? Freedom is for love. Freedom is for sacrifice. And I think you actually, I didn't think I would touch on this, but in the section on living embodied lives, you talk about the final scene of Clint Eastwood's movie Gran Torino, where he suffers for the life of the world, for the good of others. And I think that's another element. And that's hard to see, though, when you're, dying from cancer, that you're suffering for others. But this idea of redemptive suffering and participating in the sufferings of Christ, I think one could argue that's just a comforting myth.
Yeah.
Or it's false or it's true. And I think this is where you're kind of coming down to this ultimately like religious question. And our post-human future is a rejection of, in a sense, what we are, right? It's an escape from what we are.
And just to put a fine point on it, if you don't mind,
sure.
You make it's an absolutely correct point that the suffering is redemptive and it's for others. There's no dispute about this. But I think one thing that if I can take a shot at my fellow Catholics,
sure, I do that all the time.
Yeah, one thing we don't do enough of is talking about having a personal relationship with God. We don't really talk about that because I think we think of it as a Protestant thing. but there's a lot of truth in it. And I think that the way that suffering is going to be embraced, I think there's, for some people, the suffering for others might be like what they need to bear it well. But I think for other people who are maybe different temperamentally, what would help them, it certainly helped me when I've suffered, is to recognize that it's not just that I'm suffering for others, but that God has given me a gift. Right? All my experiences of God have been of just sort of indescribable compassion, certainly stern correction when needed, but always atop a kind of deep compassion for me, right? So on that foundation, I have the strength to embrace my suffering with his help because I know it's a gift from someone who loves me, right? For some people, they might do better with the redemptive aspect of it. They're both there, but it really is. I don't think we should undermine or diminish the personal dimension of it. It really is a gift of love from God to you specifically. And it's a weird thing to say. I think people will say, "Oh, you sound like someone with Stockholm syndrome. You're just like you're sort of chained to this terrible tyrant who just sends you suffering as though it's love," right? But
yeah, and you're not, and you're also not denying the fact that some suffering often comes from the evil perpetrated by others. You're not saying that it doesn't matter, like that. That's not what you're saying. Just
and this is the mystery of human freedom, right? God, I think of God as kind of like a playwright director, right? But he's more amazing than a playwright because the actors have their roles. It's a preset story and they have maybe some freedom to ad lib at certain times, but everyone kind of is going in the same direction and they've all bought into the program, right? But God brings the maximum amount of goodness even when people actively reject him, right? It is the case that the things we've suffered, if seen in the light of Christ and how Christ asks us to live and in his love, if we see it in that way, we will realize, and it's been personally true for me. I've had some personal experiences that as I've reflected, I have been able to say fully, truthfully, that it's better that this happened to me than that it did not happen. Even though it caused all this suffering and pain, it is nonetheless somehow mysteriously true that it's better that it happened than it did not. And that's a deep thing that everyone has to come to personally. I think people can talk about it. I think that's helpful for people to hear potentially, but it really is a personal journey into God that you have to experience. And that's what's going to allow this problem to be resolved well, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's, suffering is a complex thing. And I think it, in a sense, it seems like it's unrelated to what we're talking about, but this question of technology and human, ultimately what it means to be human, and then what role does suffering play? Because it is, as you said, the strongest argument against Christianity. And it's the thing we all fear, suffering. So I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me. It was interesting and I learned a lot. Do you have any final thoughts for me, for us, the listeners on technology, and then maybe any books or recommendations of things that you recommend to read that have been really helpful for you?
Sure. It's been a real pleasure, Michael. I really, really appreciate you having me on. Hopefully I can come back at some point if I've written something else that you think is interesting.
Great. And
I think final thoughts. I think just the end of the essay, public discourse would be helpful for people. It's not a comprehensive program at all for what to do, but I think you do a lot of good. People would do a lot of good for themselves if they found a nice partner and try to have, as many kids as they can feasibly have and kept their bodies in fairly good repair and went to church. I mean, I really think these kinds of activities, if approached in a spirit of generosity, humility, and, sort of keen desire, I think there'll be dividends paid out on them, I think. As for things I've read, I'm currently reading Crisis of the House Divided by Jaffa. It's very good. It's really complex. I think A New Birth of Freedom is more complex. I'll get to that after. And I think that Stanley Fish article I mentioned from 96.
And I'll put links to that up.
Yeah, it's one of the most important things in the kind of intellectual space that I've ever read. And I think people would it would be very good if more people read it and took the lessons to heart.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Dion. I really appreciate you taking the time to join the Moral Imagination. And I'll put links to all the essays we talked about and the other things you recommended and your Substack. And so you can find that. I'll show you where to find Dion if you go to the moralimagination.com. Thank you again for listening. And thanks, Dion, for joining me.
Thanks, Michael. It's been a pleasure.